International, and joining me is the former Foreign Minister, the longest-serving Foreign Minister in the nation's history, former British High Commissioner Alexander Downer. Thanks so much for your time.
It's a pleasure.
First of all, reports out of Washington that you've spoken to US investigators looking into the origins of the Russian investigation, and you've denied the fact that you were part of an effort to undermine the Trump campaign. Can you talk us through that?
Well, there's an investigation into all of this that the Americans are conducting at the moment, and the Prime Minister said that we'll cooperate with that investigation. So in that context, we don't say anything about it while the investigation's underway because, you know, public comments will play into the whole process. So we keep our public comments quiet at this stage.
The claim comes from Papadopoulos, a former junior advisor to Donald Trump, but for those who are watching from afar, they do seem quite outrageous claims.
Well, as I say, we're not going to comment on it for the time being, and people will, well, a few people might draw that conclusion, but let's just let the investigation take its course and it'll be concluded, presumably. I don't know when it will be concluded, but I assume fairly soon.
The report is as well that the attorney, John Durham, was able to look at a cable from that period, but it wasn't declassified, simply he was able to look at it. Does that make sense, I guess, given we are cooperating?
Well, as I say, I'm not going to say anything more about it. The Australian government's fully cooperating, although I don't work for the Australian government anymore. I'm obviously in touch with them on all of this, and so that's our line.
You can't elaborate.
We're fully cooperating. It's best not to, because, you know, it'll make a news story, right, for a day or two. It plays into the toxic politics of America. And America's politics is for Americans, not for us. I think we're best keeping out of it if we possibly can.
Sure. Well, let's enter British politics then, because we've got the Brexit coming up.
It's toxic as well.
It is, the election, and then I guess Brexit most likely is the scenario. You're addressing the press club today on this issue. Do you think that the election will provide clarity?
So I think there's a 70% chance it will provide clarity. The only way it will provide clarity is if the Conservatives win it. That is Boris Johnson's party. If, as they put it, Boris wins, then the agreement he already has with the EU on withdrawal from the EU will be brought into force, presumably in January sometime, and the UK will finally leave the EU after more than 3 years of squabbling about this whole issue. So that will bring clarity. If he doesn't, if the Conservatives don't get an overall majority, so I think there's only a 30% chance this will happen, but if they don't get an overall majority, then I don't think Labor will either. And the Liberal Democrats, who are a bit like the old Australian Democrats, and the SNP, the Scottish Nationalist Party, they will hold the balance of power. In those circumstances, I think Jeremy Corbyn would become the Prime Minister, and Labor's policy is to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement yet again, and then put that renegotiated withdrawal agreement to the public in a referendum 6 months later, and the Labor Party will campaign against the agreement they've negotiated with the government, with the EU. Arguing that Britain should remain in the EU. It's a bit complicated.
It's absolute.
But so
like absolute chaos.
If the Conservatives don't win, you will be back into the mire on the Brexit issue. That's what will happen. Yeah,
but his polling looks, as we discussed off-air, quite strong, and one of his strengths is Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, the thing that is definitely, I mean, the British Labour Party, so viewers will be very familiar with the Australian Labor Party. The British Labour Party is something else. It's like the sort of extremes of the Greens. It's not like the mainstream of, you know, Anthony Albanese or Bill Shorten or whatever. This is a really radical, very far left political leadership in Britain. And, you know, there's obviously a constituency for that, as I'm sure there is here, but it's not a very big one. So a lot of disillusioned moderate Labor voters will vote for the Liberal Democrats. So Labor's polling is now in the 20s.
Yeah.
Now that could change. It did during the last election in 2017. It shot up during the election campaign. I'm not sure it will happen this time, though.
One of the issues that you obviously managed as High Commissioner was Brexit. and to get the then Prime Minister to put a free trade agreement front and centre. How soon would you expect that to eventuate?
Well, I think the negotiations could begin next year. I mean, I'm saying next year, 2020. I was hoping the negotiations would have begun in 2017. So it's now, you know, years have passed because of the hesitation within the British Parliament over Brexit. But I think the negotiations can start next year. They should be relatively easy negotiations with the UK. I mean, we need more access for our services, mutual recognition of qualifications, access for our agricultural exports, and I think importantly we could get a better visa deal out of the UK as we did when we negotiated the free trade agreement with the US, so I'm optimistic about that.
Okay, well, we've got a lot of fires coverage today, unfortunately, so our time is tight, but I want to ask you one last question in relation to China.
Yeah.
It appears there's somewhat of a rapprochement between Australia and China right now. I know you keep an eye on this quite closely. The Prime Minister met Premier Li Keqiang last week, and the Trade Minister's been there 3 times. What's your best read on this relationship right now?
Well, we need to keep the relationship stable and predictable without being weak. I mean, where the Chinese have done things like interfere in our politics, where they conduct unfair trade practices, disrupt our exports to China for political reasons and so on, well, we don't, or where they cause security uncertainty in the South China Sea. We don't have to be backward in pointing that out to them and complaining about these things. We don't have to be weak, but we have to be predictable. And I think we have to avoid making extravagant statements for the sake of domestic politics. There's been a bit of that in the past, and I think we should avoid that.
Mr. Downer, as always, appreciate your time. Good to see you.
It's a pleasure.